Good morning. So I hope we can start now. My name is Andrea Rudorff. I'm a researcher at the Fritz Bauer Institute, and I have the honor to lead through this panel today, which is named Jurisdiction Poland. We, the panelists, and I have already noted that not all of the presentations relate directly to legal topics, but they are closely linked to the processes that can be observed in general and which we already discussed when talking about the Holocaust in the context of the Cold War. Our panelists introduce us to different players in the social space, the judicial authorities, survivor witnesses and their agency, as well as survivors' associations up to state institutions and their campaign policy, all with own interests and in different ways mutually influenced and embedded in the Cold War situation. Now I would like to briefly summarize the core thesis of the presentations of our three panelists. First, Audrey Kichelewski introduced us to one of the very late Polish trials against Polish citizens who had killed Jews during the German occupation. In this case, it was the commander of the local Polish police in the town of Warsaw, now in Belarus. And the trial lasted from 1963 to 1970. And it is particularly interesting because Jewish survivors living in Poland had initiated the investigation and organized witness accounts from survivor friends who lived in the US and in Israel, and they had been questioned there. Audrey emphasized that the Jewish witnesses, some of whom had only recently returned from the Soviet Union, had great confidence in the Polish justice. But in all three verdicts of the trial, two were revised by the Supreme Court. The defendant was acquitted. In the verdicts, a shift towards anti-Jewish discrimination was apparent. And in addition, the position of the Jewish witnesses became weaker as time went on, especially after the anti-Semitic campaign of 1968, when a lot of them had to leave the country. The chances that the Jewish witnesses could make themselves heard in court became more and more slim. What came into my mind by listening to her remarks was the work of Gabriel Finder and Alexander Prusin, who noted that in the early post-war years, Jewish witnesses were taken rather seriously in the Polish justice. And there is an observation about a similar development for Western Germany, that the situation of Jewish witnesses got worse from the 1960s on. Dagi Knellesen wrote about the early Sobibor trials in the German Federal Republic. And in this time, end of 40s, early 50s, the accounts of the transnational Jewish witnesses were taken rather seriously. And above all, many were still resident in Germany. In later years, from the 60s on, it can be observed that testimonies by Jewish witnesses got more and more under the general suspicion of being biased, and they tended to be suspected of seeking revenge. This discrediting of Jewish witnesses became the main target of attack for some defense lawyers, and maybe we are dealing here with similar development in different countries, despite the different political circumstances that might be worth discussing. Also very interesting were her remarks about the Soviet-Polish cooperation resulting from the resurgence of trials against war criminals in the 1960s in the Soviet Union. And that would be my first question to Audrey. Could you tell us more about the Soviet-Polish cooperation in the prosecution of war crimes? You said that authorities provided material to the Poles and gave hints. What exactly did that look like? How did it develop? And what was characteristic for the trials of this period after the big amnesty of 56? Since you said the trial you presented was rather exceptional because of the presence of the committed Jewish witnesses. I would suggest that Audrey's Audrey answers now, and after that we move on to Łukasz and Zofia. Audrey, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for this summing up of my presentation, and thank you for the invitation, this participation in this great conference. Yes, so first let me state that this project is just in the beginning, and I had wished that I could have brought much more material, but unfortunately the COVID situation had prevented me from going back to Poland and continuing my research in the archives and everything. So it's only preliminary findings that I have, and this is why it's not definite conclusions. But in any case, from the files, the trials I have been able to see so far, in many circumstances, I have we can see definitely cooperation between Polish and Soviet authorities in exchanging documents, in the fact that the Polish authorities asked for witnesses living in the Soviet Union to come and testify. It's almost never the case that they are able to come. This is also quite interesting, but they are summed up, and they send convocations and everything. And it is not always very clear if the investigation starts from the Polish side, then there is asking for documents and help, or the other way around. Sometimes we can identify it, sometimes not, at least from the files I have so far, and the archives I've been able to look at so far, but maybe I hope to be able to trace more closely. But in any case, there was an agreement, the December 1957 agreement of judicial cooperation between the two states, and it is always this agreement which is recalled in order to for this help to be to be made. And also sometimes there is the issue, because many times the defendant, there's the issue of which nationality he is, because in many cases, I mean, in most cases I've been looking so far, that the defendant was born and had the citizenship of what is after 45 the Belarusian Socialist Republic, or Lithuanian or Ukrainian, but most often the Belarusian cases, from what I've seen, and was the question of the extradition potentially, but each time this question is raised, the answer is no, because according to Article 63 of this agreement of 1957, it is not possible to extradite one's citizen for if this person has this citizenship, and since usually those defendants ended up in Poland or flee, or it's a very different situation, and very often also they change their name, and they made false identity after the war, maybe in order to escape Soviet judgment, but in any case they are, at the time of those trials in the 1960s, Polish citizens, and then in virtue of this agreement, being Polish citizen, even if they have Ukrainian or Belarusian or Lithuanian background, but they are formally Polish citizens, then they have to be trialed in Poland. So this is, yes, more or less what I can say in general about these this very complex but recurring situation of cooperation, and very interesting that I need to dig in. But so far I have only the Polish side, and obviously it would be much much better to have the Soviet side too, but that will be even more, I guess, complicated. And so
yeah, thank you so much. Maybe we have the opportunity in the panel about the Soviet Union to get more knowledge about this. Now I will continue with summarizing the presentation of Łukasz Jasiński. He showed us in his presentation how the Polish Main Commission for Investigation of Hitlerite Crimes was involved in the anti-Semitic campaign of '68. And he stated that the head of the Main Commission in this time, Czesław Kichelewski, was closely associated with a group around the Minister of Internal Affairs, Mieczysław Moczar, who was a protagonist of the campaign. Łukasz gave us some examples how Kichelewski supported the agenda of Moczar, for instance, with his critic about the anti-Nazi concentration camp in the Wielka Encyclopedia Powszechna in '67, which he accused that it emphasized the Jewish victims and marginalized the Polish victims of the camps, and the mentioning that the extermination camps were located in current Polish territory was seen as an accusation of Polish complicity in the Holocaust. On the whole, he found Polish resistance and Polish martyrology were underestimated in the encyclopedia, from which it was concluded that it was influenced by anti-Polish Zionist propaganda. Another example was the plenary session of the Main Commission in April '68, which was planned as a propaganda event and should unmask alleged Zionist propaganda, which was at work with an anti-Polish impetus. This would also control the West German trials, which would accordingly deal only with the Holocaust and not with crimes against Polish citizens. Second aim was to focus on Poles who helped Jews and on Jewish collaboration with the Germans. Kichelewski also openly attacked Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal after Wiesenthal had criticized the anti-Semitic campaign in Poland. And Kichelewski stated that Wiesenthal is not concerned with prosecuting Nazi criminals, but with anti-Polish and anti-communist propaganda. So Łukasz pointed out that '68 was the peak of the Main Commission's activities in this direction, and in the subsequent years it was not involved in such violent propagandistic actions like '68, but Polonocentrism and distrust and aversion against the West always remained characteristic for the work of the Main Commission until 1989. The question that comes to my mind after his this very interesting insights is that the elements that Łukasz mentioned as typical for the March '68 campaign, the victim competition, the great fear that Polish victims would not be sufficiently appreciated, the fear that mentioning the location of the main extermination camp could be misinterpreted as Polish contribution to the Holocaust, the great emphasis on the fact that there was no collaboration on the part of Poland, but even on the contrary, the Polish people widespread helped persecuted Jews. All these elements also play a role in today's historical political debates in Poland. And can you say when did it start that the investigation of Nazi crimes became so closely connected with the defense of the good reputation of the Polish people? Because in the immediate post-war period, this is not yet so visible what triggered this development. I would suggest we stick to the order, and Łukasz answers now, and after that we will turn to Zofia Wóycicka. Thank you, Łukasz.
Hello, yes, thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be here today and to take part in this conference. And also, thank you so much, Andrea, for the very interesting question. Well, actually, it's very hard to find some one specific factor, one key moment when this fight for the good name of Poland, Polish nation, and so on, started to play such a predominant role. And as I mentioned in my presentation, yes, indeed, the years 1967, 1968, and this anti-Semitic campaign, March 1968, events was the peak moment of propaganda involvement of the main commission. What were the reasons? I would name few of them. Mainly due to geopolitical situation, Cold War, and a post-war division of Europe, and the fact that Poland was in the Soviet sphere of influence, the communist authorities were forced to seek for social legitimization, especially after 1956, after end of the Stalinist period in Poland, as Gomułka, when the South Gomułka gained power. And since that time, we can talk about like more national-centered approach, for example, by highlighting the role of the armed resistance against the Germans, and not only the communist armed resistance, but also the Home Army or Polish armed forces in the West. So this national-centered and martyrdom-centered approach was a good tool for the communist authorities in order to seek a social legitimization. Also, the fact that in the 1960s, that the second wave of retribution started marked with the Eichmann trial or the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial played here also a role, and caused these attempts of highlighting also the Polish victims of the concentration camps. What's also interesting in this context is that, and what I would like to highlight is that some of the features of this propaganda narrative also remained in the following years. So, for example, since 1970, so it's about 2 years after the anti-Semitic campaign, we can talk about the plans of transforming the main commission into the Institute of National Remembrance, and that was the exact name which was proposed at that time. Of course, finally, this reform of the main commission took part in the year 1984, and from that time we could talk about the main commission for the investigation of the Hitlerite crimes, Institute of National Remembrance, so institute of focusing more on carrying on research and commemoration than on conducting investigations. Also, if we're talking about, for example, the 1970 decades, there were some mechanisms like utilization the main commission into propaganda operations and criticism against the so-called West German revisionists, Hubka, Chaya, and the Bundevertriebene. And also here, the pattern was quite similar. Of course, the scale was completely different, was much smaller, but the scale was, but the scheme was the same. So all information about alleged crimes of committed by Poles on the Germans after the war were also treated as some kind of German provocation and so on. So this like Polonocentric and heroic approach was a predominant feature starting from the, I would say, mid-1960s until the 1989. Also, in the context of Polish-Jewish relations, in the context of Holocaust, there's also one important thing, namely the main commission in the 1980s and also the director Pilichowski widely criticized Claude Lanzmann's Shoah documentary film. There was also a big discussion. Also, as far as I know, even General Wojciech Jaruzelski and his authorities criticized Claude Lanzmann's film as being biased or omitting the context of German occupation in Poland. So this was a long process, and it's very hard to find one specific moment. But Andrea, you're definitely right that in the 1940s, it seems that works of the main commission, at that time the main commission for investigating German war crimes in Poland, were much more professional, and at that time propaganda played a relatively smaller role than in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Łukasz. And there's a remark in the chat from Katrin Stoll that the elements of this discourse was started, of course, already during the German occupation. And she points out to the writing of Maria Kann that's only Ergänzung. So we turn to Zofia's presentation. Zofia pointed out that in 1968, also in other fields of remembrance, something was broken. In this case, the delicate but vivid bonds formed in the 1950s between Auschwitz survivors living in Eastern and Western Europe. In 1952, the International Auschwitz Committee was formed, and the cooperation between the survivors led to an internationalization of the memorial site in Auschwitz. Initially, the system antagonism between East and West did not play a major role in these contexts because the survivors who were involved were often communists themselves or had sympathies for communism. Those with other political opinions were not likely to get involved there. That's another topic to discuss. However, the first problems appeared in the late 1950s when East European communists in the International Auschwitz Committee criticized the Soviet invasion of Hungary in October 1956. Moreover, there was an increasing conflict because the Jewish victims were made invisible in the communist narrative of remembrance, which erupted in a dispute over the design of an international monument in Auschwitz. And in this way, the year 1968 became the year of a separation between East and West European survivor communities that had already been foreseeable. Zofia concluded that the attempts to build a common European memory of Auschwitz were limited, and I quote her now, ultimately crashed against the Iron Curtain. At the end of her presentation, Zofia draws a line to the current developments in the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Site, the suspension of the International Auschwitz Council in 2018 by the Polish state. And this could point to a renewed nationalization of commemoration. I'm sure we all are interested in what impact this has today on the work of the memorial site and whether this impact is evident in the case already. And can we interpret the suspension as a kind of continuation of the old dispute, or are there totally new issues present in the arguments today? So that would be very interesting. The floor is yours, Zofia.
Thanks for the brilliant summary, and in general for inviting me to the conference. First to the current situation, I am well. In general, I think the difference between what was then and what is now is that first, Poland is still maybe not now yet a fully democratic state at the moment, but it's not a full dictatorship as it was in the 60s or in the 70s. It's a member of the NATO and of the European Union and of several international organizations also dealing with the Holocaust, like the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. So independently of what happened to the independently of the suspension of the International Auschwitz Council, I guess there are also other sort of channels of putting pressure on the Polish government and also on the museum itself in cases of conflict. And then, of course, we are living in a globalized world, so I guess the role of the museum with the internet and so on, the role of the museum as a place of shaping the memory of the Holocaust in Poland and and obviously also in general in the world is limited. It's not the only platform of shaping this memory, or not such an important platform. And then the situation is like that of course this council was suspended, but the director of the museum till now is unchanged. It's Piotr Cywinski, who was director even before the change of power, and he seems, I think, quite probably he has also to he's put under pressure, but he is quite autonomous in what he is doing. Until now, nothing, to my knowledge, nothing very bad happened there, or nothing which would be very, very controversial. Of course, there is this controversy about the Museum of the Righteous of Auschwitz, but this is another issue. But but of course, the suspension of this International Auschwitz Committee, it's an act of kind of dramatic diplomatic stupidity. Yes, this was a council which was on one hand consulting the Auschwitz Museum and also helping it in situations of conflict, but it also legitimized this site vis-a-vis the international public. So in case of each of conflict, and this is still a contentious place, it would sort of legitimize the standing of the museum or the position of the museum, and also help raise money for this institution, which is, you know, so suspending it's really a very stupid thing. And in general, yes, I think there are similarities. I think what stands behind is this idea that we have to take control over this place, and we have to shape it into a place of where the Polish martyrdom is stressed more, and maybe also this question of the righteous, and that we have to stress the sort of good side of Polish behavior during the World War, the Second World War, heroism and help for Jews and whatever. So in that sense, there are similarities. And I also have had a comment to what was discussed before, but maybe I will come to that later, to the state of genealogy of this heroic narrative. I also think it's much older than Pilichowski.
Yeah, we can continue this now. For me, in my question, it was rather the question why it was so strongly related to the investigation of Nazi crimes, because that was in this point, it was not visible in the first post-war years, but that the threat is much older. That I think it's clear. But please add to what you want to say to this topic. We can discuss it.
No, okay. It's just yes. In general, I want to say that this kind of I think there is already in the late 40s there is a clear sort of alliance between the sort of communist narrative and the nationalist narrative, which at that time in the 50s is sort of very communist anti-fascism, but still very strong heroic. And then in the late 50s, this sort of anti-fascist element is getting a bit less strong, and this nationalist element. So we, the Poles, independently on if we are in the Armia Krajowa and the Home Army, or on the other side, we were heroic. And of course, also this righteous motive. This is very old and starts already during the war. And then in the 40s with the Kielce pogrom, it stressed very much. We had so many people who helped, so we can't be so bad. And then it reappears in the 60s very forcefully. And this is also what we see now. So in a way, what we see now, I would say that part of the piece talks Gomułka in the sphere of historical memory.
Can I just add one remark to what Zofia said?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because well, yeah, of course, this general tendency of putting an accent onto the positive or heroic side of the Polish-Jewish relations, of history of Poland during the Second World War was much older than Pilichowski or Moczar and his party fraction. But I know the point is that in my research I focused only on the main commission. Yeah. So if I investigated, so to speak, the activities of the main commission, so there's a big difference in the narrative of this institution between 1940s and 60s. So that was my point. And what is also interesting, but Zofia Wóycicka mentioned the 1950s. So it's also a kind of paradox, because actually the works of the main commission were put into a hold between 1949 and 1963. So it's also interesting that in the decade of 1950s, when there was this, as Zofia mentioned, this heroic approach and so forth, the main commission only existed on the margins of Polish judicial systems. It was the seat of the main commission, the office of the main commission were just two small rooms in the Ministry of Justice in Warsaw. And this was also a paradoxical situation, which I would like to stress here.
Thank you so much. I would like to turn to the chat questions now, because half of the time has passed already, and there's a question for Audrey. In your talk, you mentioned that the material from the Soviet Union was not taken as automatically sufficient. How was it commented on in the court proceeding? Do you have a sense of the judicial record of the people involved in Stanisław ? Trial? I'm curious why you anonymize him in your paper. Please, Audrey.
Yes, thank you, Natalia, for this question. Very important. Yes, for the issue of anonymization, I can answer on different level. First and most obviously, because as I told before, it's like a work in progress. So I'm just it was not intended to be a public paper on the internet. So this is also why, yes, because of the publicity of the conference and of this paper. Also because in maybe the I don't know, the French custom of we usually anonymize name of people who even if they are dead for a long time, but it's kind of custom that we have in the scientific writing, and but then again, it's really not difficult to find the name of this person. Even if in my future work, I mean the trials have I have the signature of all the documents, and the ISKOR book names the person. So I mean, if you want to know who this person is, it's really not difficult to find out. As for the question on the Soviet documents, yes, this is quite interesting, because in this particular case comes in two testimonies from two other policemen, from two Belarusian policemen, and who accused the defendant probably in order to exonerate themselves from their own crimes for which they were condemned in the Soviet Union. And the court states explicitly that probably it's not a reliable testimony, and this is why it should not be taken into account. And I thought that it was quite interesting to stress this. It's not stated that, oh, okay, because it comes from abroad, but just it is considered as any other source, and not more seriously than other testimonies coming from New York or from Israel. So this is what I wanted to point out. But there were other cases, in other trials when Soviet testimonies were deemed really reliable, and were the main ground for which the defendant was condemned. So it's not a general case, and I would again need to have more case studies in order to ascertain which what rule, if such a rule was. Or I would say it's really depending on the court and on what was trialed. And also what I wanted to add is that on the cases I studied, there was this dimension of I chose them precisely because this dimension of direct participation in killing of Jewish victims. But most generally, there were other crimes committed, and very often the motive of killing Jews was abandoned because lack of proof. Well, and if there were enough proofs to ascertain the killing of a Polish civilian or Soviet partisan, then there was a condemnation. But the motive of the Holocaust and the narrative of what was happening during the ghetto or the liquidation of the ghetto appeared in the trial, and this is what it is interesting. But it was very rarely, if even, what was retained for usually lack of proof. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will continue with further questions. There's a question for Zofia from Agata Petashik. Can the location of the monument in Auschwitz-Birkenau rather than Auschwitz I be also seen as a political gesture, and where the attempts to establish a more inclusive European memory visible also in the museum exhibition?
Yes, thanks for this question. To the exhibitions, yes, in that sense, that starting from the beginning of the 60s, I think, you have this idea, and it's really done, that of establishing those national exhibitions. So the main exhibition, which is rather small in one of the barracks, it changes, but I don't think it's more internationalist than the one before. It's just maybe less propagandistic a bit, or less actual political. But you have those new national exhibitions, and those are, I don't remember which, but those are both countries from Eastern and Western Europe which contribute with their national exhibitions. And this is clearly a sort of idea of internationalization. And in regard to the placement of the monument in Birkenau rather than in Auschwitz I, yeah, yes and no. So I think it was a clear sort of, well, political gesture, but it was sort of an obvious thing, because the main organization who sort of pushed for this monument was the International Auschwitz Committee. So there was no option to build it in Auschwitz I. But at that time, when they sort of they announced this competition in 1957, they even in this International Auschwitz Committee had a sort of idea of Auschwitz-Birkenau as a place more of international martyrdom, not Polish suffering, but international. They even in this competition announcement, they wouldn't stress the Jewish suffering. They spoke of men, women, and children from whatever, 22 nations. So this was meant as more internationalist, and this why Birkenau, but not so much Jewish at that time. And this conflict only emerged later in the late 60s, and I think it was also due to the Eichmann trial and to the Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt, that for the West German, the West European, sorry, committee members, this well, specificity of the Jewish suffering in Auschwitz, of the genocide, became more clear, and they wanted this to be more stressed, which was not the case in the late 50s, even from many of the people, the committee members from the West. So if this is a response, I think yes.
There's another question from the chat that fits very well, because it's about the question of how they were called, as Jewish victims or as Polish victims. And the question stated that in Poland they were rather called as a Jewish victim and perceived as Jewish victims than in the Soviet Union, where they are rather called as Soviet citizens. And you said that it came later in the 60s, this approach, but yeah, maybe you can, the three of you can answer this question. This distinct Polish approach, was it a distinct Polish approach, or yeah, what do you think about it?
I think it changes with time. So and then it's I think so very fast already in the 40s you have this well, you would speak very general, and this is also this well, like in Soviet Union, you would speak very general, this internationalist idea that it's men, that's exactly this phrase, men, women, men and children from 22 countries. So you would look at the countries and not at the nationalities, and then Jews would be almost, well, not existent. And of course, Birkenau was important because everybody knew that this is the actual place of genocide, however you call the victims. And to kind of nobilitate Auschwitz as a whole, you had to stress this aspect. But the whole commemoration took place till the 60s. The whole commemoration took place in Auschwitz, and there clearly also in Auschwitz I, and there clearly the suffering of the Polish prisoners was stressed. Yes, and I think, and as said, I think to a certain moment, even Western European communists or members of the Auschwitz Committee would sign under these interpretations that those were just men, women, and children from 22 countries, and only when this awareness of the Holocaust, even if it was not called like that at that time, in the 60s, in Western Europe, started to grow, this became more kind of element of conflict. But of course, in Poland, you had this Jewish minority, and at least in the 40s, it was still very active, trying to commemorate Jewish victims. And they didn't say Holocaust, but they said about the Jewish catastrophe, and they very much stressed that they feel that their fate was very different from the fate of other groups, and they tried really to well, lobby in a way for the commemoration of the Jewish victims. And to a certain point, to the beginning of the 50s, they succeeded. You had a Jewish exhibition in Majdanek. It was already mentioned by Agata Pietrasik. You had the Jewish exhibition in Auschwitz, Birkenau, and they were all dismantled end of the 40s. This is maybe Audrey and Łukasz can add something.
You want to add something?
About the specificity of Jewish-Polish distinction, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in the trial case I studied, it was one of the things, many things that was very striking. Actually, the Supreme Court, when it overturns the first verdict in 1965, among other sentence, it states that yes, it was said that all the statements against the defendant, I quote, came from Jewish witnesses, while neither of the Polish one had testified against him, and so this was one of the reason that that made this suspicious of this person being having committed those crimes, but the Supreme Court said that this was not a legal reason to dismiss them, and it states that introduced distinctive value, I quote, of the witness according to criteria that are not legally valid and even conflicting with the Polish People's Republic judicial law. So it was really no, we're not accepting this kind of ethnic justice way, and reinforcing the universal law, which should be the same for all Polish citizens. And that was quite interesting for me to see this clearly written in 1965. And then the trial goes on, and this totally disappeared after in the last verdict in 1970. So this is also why I would I agree that there is a certain continuity in the way of thinking those issues throughout those decades, but still, I would see that after the mid-60s, there is something that is going on, and this trial shows it very well. Why introducing the motive of helping Jews in order to legitimize this person? Why introduce and convoking a historian specialist of Armia Krajowa to ascertain that in fact this person was a member of the resistance, therefore it's not possible that he can have taken part in killing Jews. And this appears only in the second and third trial, the later trial, and in the last phase after 68. And I think it's not incidental. It's just related to the general political context. Thanks.
I would continue with the chat. I have a really interesting question to Łukasz. Could you tell us a little bit about what happened inside the commission when faced with political pressure? Were there internal tensions or conflicts, resignations that would be a question of in my list as well? What have been the leeways of the main commission? So that would be interesting.
I mean, it's a very interesting question indeed. So as far as I know, and as I researched on this topic for many years, I didn't find any examples of some kind of protests of internal conflicts inside the commission itself. So it was even in some such moments as 1967, 1968, is what this institution found itself under immense political pressure. So I suppose that it was the main commission, and the situation in the main commission was quite similar to the situation in the Polish People's Republic and the social situation at that time. So it was somewhere between a resistance against the system and mainly trying to fit into the particular situation, to fit into the situation of political pressure. So because I didn't find any examples of protests or open letters that we are falsifying the history of the Second World War. It's improper. We shouldn't do it in such way. No, I didn't find any example of it. On the broader perspective, we have to put in the mind the fact that the main commission was quite an ambiguous institution, because in the frames of this institution worked or cooperated many historians like Czesław Madajczyk, Władysław Bartoszewski, and so on the one hand. On the other hand, people like Czesław Pilichowski, so people very close to this nationalist fraction of the Polish United People's Party, and so on. We can find in the main commission, and also in the local commissions, some members who were, for example, Stalinist judges during 1940s, 1950s on the one hand, and the Home Army soldiers on the other hand. So that's very, all in all, of course, the main commission played quite an ambiguous role, but I think that the most common way of behaving of members of the main commission was simply like trying to fit into the situation, trying to do whatever is possible, and to some extent also collaborating with or taking part in the propaganda campaigns. So it's hard to describe, but certainly there was no big wave of resisting this campaign from 1967-68, trying the big wave of resignations or so forth, or so on. No.
And what's about the pressure of the Jewish survivor scholars that asked Katrin Stoll that was exerted to Pilichowski in the I can read it. Can you say a little about the pressure that Czesław Pilichowski exerted on Jewish survivor scholars employed at the main commission, Szymon Datner, for instance, when it comes to complying with the false notion that Poles and Jews were equal victims of the German occupation, persecution, and extermination policy?
Oh yeah, when we're talking about Szymon Datner, of course, at that time between 1967 and 1968, he publicized, probably he was forced to publish a big list of names of Poles who were prosecuted or simply murdered by the Germans for helping the Jews. So thanks to this publication, he like also tried to fit in this situation. So I know this one name, yes, Szymon Datner, who was of course under immense pressure of Pilichowski, and he actually played this game. So he didn't like protested or something like this. No, he played this game. And however, it's of course, if we are talking about personal pressure of director to one of his employees, it's very hard to find any traces in documents. It's rather a matter of finding the climate of this particular year, of this particular moment, and look for the publications from that time. And yes, Szymon Datner played an important role, and his publications played an important role in this propaganda campaign of showing the role of Polish of Poles who tried to help Jews during the war, and actually who were prosecuted by this for this by the Germans. So yeah, I can name this one particular name, Szymon Datner. If there were more cases of this, well, hard to say. But this once again shows the ambiguity of the main commission as the whole institution, and how ambiguous role it played during the times of the Polish People's Republic.
Thank you. There's another question for Zofia. Could you say more about the project submitted by Rappaport and Zaposniow?
About Natalia, about Rappaport, I can't say much because I have never seen photos. I think there is a description of those submitted projects in a PhD by Spielmann. Now I forgot the first name. but I can send you the information, the PhD. I think I have it, even I can send it to you. But as far as Shapachnikov is concerned, can I show my screen? Is it possible? Then I could show it to you.
Yeah, I think you have a host.
Now, okay. No, der Host hat die Freigabe des Teilnehmerbildschirms deaktiviert.
I allowed it right now. I think it should work now.
Okay, because actually I had the presentation, but I was not able to activate it when I recorded my presentation. But here you can see on the left side. This is a sketch of the project by Shapachnikov. So it was interesting just to mention. You will know some of the history of the Hansen monument, the design which won the competition, but then was not really realized. There were quite a few very interesting also Polish designs or ideas for designs which were very sort of counter-heroic. And I guess this would be, Shapachnikov would be one of the, and for Rappaport, I don't know, I or at least I can't remember exactly what his proposal was, but maybe in Spielmann's book there is a description. I never saw sketches. Mm-hmm.
I would add a question to Zofia, whether there were in the time you studied also discussion about other victim groups in Auschwitz, the Roma and Sinti, for instance, and also the various groups of resistance formations in non-Jewish Poles with different political backgrounds. For instance, the deportees of the Warsaw Uprising or Armia Krajowa resistance fighters, or even right-wing resistance fighters. Which role did they play in the discussions about representation in the Auschwitz Memorial Site?
Okay, so one thing, Sinti and Roma, and I said that I think to my mind, this was never a point of discussion till the 1990s, yes? Because the non-Sinti and Roma were not very much interested in this aspect. And the Sinti and Roma did not exist in Poland as a sort of memory group which would be visible and active. So there was basically one author who wrote about the Sinti and Roma, but in a later period in the 60s and 70s. But this was never a topic in Auschwitz-Birkenau in the museum till the 90s. And then of course you had conflicts not only between the Jewish survivors and the others or the Poles, but you had also internal tensions between the different victim groups and categories within the sort of the group of Polish prisoners, and this was already on a very early stage, already in the 40s. So first, when there was this association of the former camp prisoners, I should be short, I think, which was established very early, 46. And in the beginning, it was meant as an association of victims of the camps, no matter what they are, so political allegation or if they were resistance fighters, was a self-help organization. And then under political pressure from the communist side, but also you had groups of people in this association which were interested and supported this politics, it turned more and more into a combatant organization, a veteran organization. And this meant also a fitting within this association, which excluded everybody who was first, they would not take anyway non-political victims. So, for example, those who were categorized by the Germans as criminals or asocials, they would not be members of this association. And then they excluded also all which could not prove that they were really engaged in resistance, even if they were categorized by the German as political prisoners. And this meant, for example, the civilians from the Warsaw Uprising, which ended up in Auschwitz. in 1944, they said, you're not really resistant, so you're maybe victims, but you should not be members of our associations and you should not get all the support and so on. So this was one tension between this political and non-political. Obviously also then came this issue, well, political, but on one side. And then I would mention one more group, which was, because when we say about Birkenau, we always say it's the marginalization of the Jewish suffering, but it's also the marginalization of the women, because the women inmates in Auschwitz, they were incarcerated in Birkenau.
Yeah.
And this focus on Auschwitz also marginalized all those stories of Kichelewski and so on. This happens all in Birkenau, but they were not represented in this commemoration. Mm-hmm. So, to be short.
Yeah, thank you very much. Our time is over now. It's much aspects to discuss longer, but we have to close now. And I thank all the participants for the questions and the discussion. And we have now a 15 minutes break, and our next panel starts at 11:30. And now I will hand back to Hannah.